Chapter 31 May 1989, Beijing. Mid-afternoon on a bright spring day, and the restaurant was nearly empty. John sat by a window looking down on Chang'an Avenue, the pulsing heart of the nation's great capital, Beijing. His hands were not quite steady as he lifted his glass for a sip of whiskey to calm his nerves. In the distance, the yellow glaze of imperial rooftops glistened in the sunshine, and he could see the crowds of students milling about Tiananmen Square. He was deeply moved by their fearlessness in speaking out against the government, yet he worried that the stalemate would likely end in trouble. And trouble, in such an already volatile place, was not something he wanted to see. He glanced at his watch, wondering whether Ben would show, and as usual the niggling worry began to creep in. Had he been found out? Did Ben somehow know what his real motives were? Were the military police already on their way to the restaurant? "Mr. Thompson?" A man called from across the room, smiling and waving as he hurried toward John. His round face looked younger than his 50 years, while the unbuttoned blue cardigan accented the bulge at his waist. "So sorry to be late. Traffic is a mess with all these student protests," he apologized with a jovial chuckle. John stood up and put his hand out. "No worries. Nice to meet you, Ben." Ben settled in the chair across the table. "So, you work for the Shanghai American Embassy?" John nodded. "Yes, I'm a cultural attaché, specializing in science and cultural exchange between China and the US. You were recommended to me as someone I could contact." He didn't mention Zoe, afraid to take even the slightest risk of involving her. To deflect any questions, he quickly added, "Your English is remarkably good." Ben smiled, obviously proud, despite his quick protest. "You flatter me." After ordering some food and drinks, Ben asked, "How long have you been in China? Have you adjusted to the culture shock?" "About a year, and I'm enjoying it immensely. Friendly people, delicious food, and of course, stunning scenery and history." Ben's eyes lit up, and he opened his mouth to embellish his country's virtues. But John continued without waiting for a response. "At the moment, I'm working on a new project, encouraging US energy businesses to invest in your companies and sending experts to help China implement our latest technology. In exchange, China will send students and some of your experts to America for study and research." Ben hesitated. "Cultural exchange programs are decided by the Foreign Affairs Bureau. My office just carries out their recommendations." "Can you suggest potentially beneficial programs to your superiors? I would think since you're at COMSTIND, we might be able to advocate for some valuable exchange programs." Ben swirled the drink in his glass, as if deep in thought, and didn't answer. John continued. "For instance, I know China is interested in improving the safety of its nuclear power plants. Dr. Jimmy Lin could provide expertise on America's advanced reactor control systems to enhance your nuclear safety protocol. In exchange, China can send some scientists to America in other areas." His eyes watched for a reaction. "You mean Dr. Lin at Lawrence Livermore?" John feigned surprise. "You know him?" "I met him a couple of times when I was at the Northern Military Corporation." "Yes, Dr. Lin is quite competent. He thinks science offers unlimited potential with no boundaries. His job is to help underdeveloped countries, such as China and Pakistan, with nuclear programs. We think along the same lines. That's why I'm here, in fact." Ben looked at John, trying to gauge what John knew. "Your thinking might be similar, but you take very different approaches, I think. You work for the US government, trying to improve the relationship between our countries. Jimmy Lin works only for himself, for money. He doesn't strike me as being excessively wealthy. He may not throw it around, but with the money we've paid him, he could build himself Buckingham Palace." Apparently Ben has a high regard for the power of money. "What did he do that was worth such lavish payments?" Just then the food arrived. Ben waited until the server had left, and then threw a quick glance around the room and continued. "About 5 years ago, when I was still at the Northern Military Corporation, he helped us set up the computer codes and software for our missile systems. I don't know what else he may have done since then. I'm not in that department anymore, but I can say, with certainty, that he's gotten more than just what we paid him for." He hesitated momentarily. "Much, much more, if you know what I mean." "Your work now is on civil projects," John guessed, trying not to be too obvious with his probing. He didn't want Ben to get suspicious on their very first meeting. Busying himself with his sweet and sour pork, he said mildly, "Well, I don't know about any of that, but I'm sure Dr. Lin has a lot to offer." Ben merely nodded, digging into his garlic sesame chicken and wondering if he'd said too much. Just then, a roar from the street below made them both turn to the window. In the distance, a sea of demonstrators, shouting and waving flags and signs, surged down Chang'an Avenue toward the square. "I hope these protests can be resolved peacefully, so nobody gets hurt." Because Ben was a government official, John needed to be careful about showing support for the student movement. Ben's shoulders sagged, and he shook his head in dismay. "My son, David, has been in Tiananmen Square for nearly 2 weeks. I'm dreadfully worried about him. I tried to convince him to come home, but," he sighed, "I don't know what else I can do now." Without the vaguest idea what he might actually be able to do, John jumped at the chance to cement Ben's confidence. "If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know." A grateful smile brightened Ben's face. He was impressed that a foreign diplomat would offer to help with his personal problems, so he reached for the wine bottle, filled both glasses, and raised his in salute. "A toast to our friendship." John smiled and lifted his glass in return, pleased at how the conversation had gone, and sure he had gained Ben's trust. "Cheers." Ben took the last few bites of his lunch and drained his glass. "I need to get back to work now. Thanks for your ideas. I'll think about your suggestion and discuss possibilities with my boss. If we come up with something of interest, I'll call you," he said, motioning for the waitress. No, don't even think about it, John. I'll get the bill." "Well, thanks, Ben." John hid his disappointed surprise. Instinct told him Ben was too concerned about his son's involvement in political unrest to think much about John's proposals. But after all, he reminded himself, spying was a game of patience, a business of slow, calculated moves and counter-moves. "Thank you for your hospitality. I'll be sure to cover our next meal. Can we meet again soon?" Ben laughed, just a little nervously, John thought, as he pushed back from the table. Sure. Call me anytime. And I hope everything with your son turns out okay too." "Thank you so much." Ben reached out and shook John's hand. John stepped out of the phone booth, stretching his arm and wiggling his fingers to relieve the stiffness. His left ear was numb from the hour-long talk with Zoe, but his heart thumped with anticipation. Since arriving in Beijing 3 weeks ago, he had called her twice a week on her regular evening at the Shanghai Female Engineers Fellowship meetings, and he'd found a public phone booth on a quiet side street where he could call without the fear of being overheard. Each conversation intensified both his desire to see her and his guilt for his continuing lies and excuses for delaying his promised return to Shanghai. He had no respect for people who lied to him, and now he hated himself for doing exactly the thing he detested, especially to her. The feeling knifed through his heart with painful stabs until he started to regret ever accepting this despicable job. Still, he had to be pleased at how his meetings with Ben were playing out. They'd met 3 times in as many weeks now, and Ben's attitude was gradually shifting from formal and official to more personal and relaxed. They chatted about hobbies and overseas experiences, surprised to find they had several common interests. Ben told John how he hosted a top Pakistani nuclear scientist and accompanied the man to the Great Northwest Military Zone. He even admitted that China had sold nuclear weapons technology to Pakistan. John was careful not to mention his own eye-opening experience in Pakistan. His report to the Atomic Energy Commission had urged the US government to use IAEA to impose stricter safeguards on Pakistan's nuclear program, concluding, "Otherwise, Pakistan will allow, or may have already allowed, its spent fuel to be diverted to military applications for reprocessing and extracting weapons-grade uranium or plutonium. If that event transpires, nothing can stop Pakistan from achieving its desired status as a nuclear-armed nation." Ben's admission only made John more determined to curb the relentless spread of nuclear materials. Every time he thought about how the White House chose to ignore his recommendations, instead rewarding Pakistan with ever more money and fewer restrictions, he felt a personal betrayal that chipped away at his patriotism. Somehow, though, he always seemed to want to be a hero for his country. At their last meeting, Ben had accepted the $5,000, promising to find out what Angua did on his frequent trips to the States. Of course, John couldn't share that news with Zoe, but he felt certain he was getting closer to positively identifying Jimmy Lin as the US mole, and soon he could return home with Zoe. Thinking of her, he quickened his steps. As he rounded the corner onto Chang'an Avenue, he took in the teeming atmosphere and bustling street life. The military searchlight arced across the dark sky, illuminating everything in its path and turning the night into a mosaic of shifting shadows and brilliant white. He walked toward the hotel, ecstatic with the excitement of his imminent success and feeling like a first-hand witness to history come alive.